Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Improving the Legitimacy of Product Declaration, the Product Category Rule Guidance. I'm Debbie Steckel, Executive Director of ACLCA. For those of you who don't know, ACLCA is a nonprofit membership organization that brings together diverse organizations with a stake in the implementation and application of LCA. ACLCA also produces the LCA Annual Conference, which will take place September 26th through 29th in Charleston, South Carolina. And we have just opened the call for abstracts and registration, along with our monthly webinars, member newsletter, certification program, and active industry education policy and product category rule committees. Given the relevance of the PCR committee for this particular webinar, I've put above the mission, the chair, and if you have other questions or information you would like about the committee, you can send an email. Some quick logistics for the webinar. Today's webinar will be taped and a link to the recording will be sent out in an email on Monday, February 29th. All attendees are muted in listen-only mode. There will be an opportunity for questions, and if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat question box and send them along, and that we will answer them, or Wes will answer them during the webinar. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Wes Ingwersen. Dr. Ingwersen obtained his Ph.D. in environmental engineering from the University of Florida in 2010. Life cycle assessment was the topic of his dissertation. He was in the first class to be certified by the American Center for Life Cycle Assessment as a certified LCA practitioner. From 2012 to 2013, he led an international effort with experts from 13 countries and regions to develop the guidance for product category rule development. Rules that describe how LCAs are to be conducted for life cycle based on product labels and declaration. He has served on various advisory boards and technical committees on LCA, including most recently the U.S. Green Building Council's Committee on LCA and EPDs for use in the LEED and Green Building Standards. He currently leads LCA software development for the LCA Research Group in the National Risk Management Research Laboratory. I will turn it over to Wes and get his screen up for everyone.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Okay, I'm going to show my screen now. Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be back here today giving a webinar for the American Center for LCA as part of their regular series. Today, I'm going to be talking about the guidance for product category rule development. The title of the talk is Improving the Legitimacy of Product Declarations, the product category rule guidance document. I am, as Debbie mentioned, I'm with the EPA, but I'm presenting this work on behalf of the American Center for LCA's PCR committee, and I will explain during the talk the relationship to this work. So this is the first time I've really had the opportunity to speak widely about the guidance in a couple years. So I'm going to capture some of the developments or impacts that it's had that I'm familiar with since then, as well as go into some of the details. So right now I'm just showing you the cover page for the guidance document. It's available for download at pcrguidance.org. I think most of you probably already have a copy of it. You might have obtained it there or elsewhere. Just wanted to give you the reference again for this is what we're talking about, and it's still the version 1.0 is the most recent version from the end of August in 2013. So today I would still like to talk about the background and drivers. It's been a couple years, or many of you may not be familiar with where this whole initiative came from in the first place, and I think it's still important to mention. Then I'll describe the development process of the guidance document and provide a little information that I have on its usage and impact since then, and its current management. But I'll try to spend the bulk of the time really talking about the meat of what's in the guidance document and go into a little bit of detail that I haven't before in previous presentations or webinars. particularly about the landscape about 5 years ago, at the time in which this effort was started up, was seeing the continued proliferation of a number of standards out there for that referred to product category rules, and these were all different standards for developing lifecycle-based claims, whether carbon footprinting or full multi-attributes EPD style, as in 14025. But I want to mention, I wanted to show you these standards here again, because many of you are perhaps most familiar with, if you're coming from the EPD world, with 14025, or maybe some of the specific standards related to that, like the building sector standards, like the European standard 15804. But there also, especially 5 years ago, there was a lot of interest in the carbon footprinting standards as well. And all of these were product claim standards based on LCA. These standards were all in agreement that for external reporting, for companies that wanted to publish a footprint results or an EPD, that product category rules were necessary, and they were necessary so readers could use the LCA results ultimately for comparative purposes. Now, I want to make this really clear, because sometimes this is an issue, that this is not the same thing as a comparative assertion that's stated in ISO 14044. EPDs in themselves never state that a product A is better than a product B. They're supposed to present a standardized form of a standardized set of information based on an LCA for product A, and if another standardized set of information based on the same PCR and following a number of other principles that we'll mention here was produced for product B, then it should be comparable from a user's perspective. What's common? The commonality here is that all of these standards, whether they state that they need a PCR or some other equivalent, it's basically in there. Sometimes some of them refer to as a sector guidance or so forth, but they're different names, but they're all referring to this basic concept of a PCR. At least at that time, and I know this is still an issue out there, is there are multiple PCRs that exist already for the same product category. There's a duplication of PCRs then that are out there, and they're inconsistent in simple things like the format, but more important detail is like the methods of modeling rules that are used in preparing the LCA results. And this can actually threaten the legitimacy of the LCA-based product claims, because it does prevent comparability, and additionally, it increases the burden of preparing claims, because what's been done in the past is when a group wants to do an EPD and they don't do a thorough search of PCRs that exist out there, then there's been an effort to develop a new PCR, which is quite intensive sometimes, just to develop an EPD. So where did this come from? I'm going to take us back to around 2010, 2011, and there were a series of regular meetings about twice a year in Europe that were part of the Product Carbon Footprint Forum. These have in recent years merged into the PEF Forum. But at these meetings, there was a group called the PCR Roundtable. And the PCR Roundtable is one of the first groups that started having these discussions. They're realizing that we need PCRs out there, but there are a lot of obstacles to getting them out there. They actually formed a PCR task force, kind of a small group of experts, and I was one of the members of that task force. So Rita Schenck was as well, and there were others from Europe and North America that were part of the task force too. And they basically pointed to two major things that needed to be done to improve the PCR landscape. One was a guidance document, and another was a global registry of PCRs. They also commissioned, or not commissioned, but a study came out of this on comparison of existing PCRs within the same category, and that's published now in the Journal of International Life Cycle Assessment. And that was something that was a piece that ACLCA took the lead on. At the annual ACLCA conference, around that time, the LCA 11 conference, there was the first special session on PCR alignment, and a lot of these issues were discussed in North America for the first time in a large forum. So shortly after that, since I was on the PCR task force, Rita Schenck was as well, we decided that the ACLCA PCR committee was actually the place to start out at the guidance document. Actually, the PCR committee, prior to that time, had been involved in developing a draft guidance document for program operators. So it built on their experience, and it made sense as a forum for this effort to start out of. However, we realized this needed to be a global guidance document, which implied that just having participants from within North America would not be sufficient for that purposes. So we didn't take this effort to a standards body because we needed it to be done in a shorter period of time, and we really wanted to be more detailed and thorough than a standards document would be, and perhaps get participation from people in various organizations that don't necessarily regularly participate in the standards process. So for those reasons, we basically launched our own grassroots effort called the Product Category Rule Guidance Development Initiative. And we opened it up to as many interested parties that we could reach internationally as possible. All participation was voluntary. It was an unfunded effort. It was just people providing their own time in kind based on the interests of their organization. And we led it by it was principled by collaboration and transparency in the process. The roles that were played by members of the initiative, where there were two leads, as myself and B. Subramanian. There were drafters of the actual text, including chapter leads, and then just other drafters. And at the very beginning, we formed a steering committee to help guide us in this effort, and I'll show you members of all of those that played those roles in an upcoming slide. We also had reviewers, of course. So once the initiative was formed, then we established this goal of creating a guidance document that would promote the alignment of PCRs across product categories. So it's aligning PCRs not just within product categories, but across them. We wanted a consistent format and structure, and that's where the idea of the template came from. And of course, consistent requirements for all of the LCA rules so that LCA results could be as comparable as possible, at least of increased comparability. We also wanted to make them flexible. For one, we're trying to develop one PCR that would meet the requirements of multiple standards, the standards I showed in some of the slides before. Some of those are single attribute claim standards, like the carbon footprint standards, and others like the EPD standards or multi-attribute claims. But we still thought a single PCR could function for both of them. And we wanted it to be able to support geographic variability, so various programs operating in different regions of the world would still be able to draw upon the same PCR for consistency. So these are the core principles. I've mentioned some of them and all, but just like the title of my talk, of course, improving the legitimacy and the comparability of PCRs was one of the important principles. So what was the guidance then intended to do? Well, first and foremost, it was intended to supplement existing LCA-based product claim standards and not override those standards. We wanted to provide a lot of additional guidance to many of the parties involved, including the program operators, where that was not specified in an existing international standard. Develop a list of common elements for PCRs that all PCRs should contain, and I'll describe some of those later. And create a template, as I mentioned, for a consistent format, and then provide instructions on how to develop new PCRs and adapt an existing PCR that's out there. That had not been described at all before. So it wasn't intended to override or preempt the development of any of the existing standards, or we know we weren't a standards body. This was a grassroots initiative, as I mentioned. So it can't act as a standard by itself, and it doesn't have quite the level of detail to do that. It draws upon language that's in these existing standards. So we didn't want to preclude application to any of these particular standards. So that we envisioned a few different applications for the guidance document. For one, it actually could go back to be used by the standards developers to improve the existing standards or develop new standards. And of course, program operators were a major target audience of the guidance document, so they could use that to in the development of the PCR process or advance or supplement their own program operator instructions. And finally, the users also would include groups that were interested in developing PCRs or EPDs, or just learning a lot more about best practices even in LCA. So that would definitely be manufacturers or other LCA practitioners and interested parties. And I think we actually have evidence of all three groups using those now, and I'll talk about that next. Well, let me first acknowledge, this is really important because I was just one member of a larger effort. There were really 60+ people involved if you include some of the people that provided extensive formal comments. They represented 40+ organizations and present in 13 countries and as well as the European Union. So those are the logos of many but not all of the organizations that were involved. This is as they're published in the preface of the guidance document. We began, just a quick overview of the timeline. It started again back in late 2011. The ACLCA PCR committee decided to take a lead and launch this effort, and the independent initiative was founded in 2012. The drafting took, it really took the large part of a year to get it into the first internal draft stage. But then we went through a pretty extensive internal review period among all of the participants I mentioned, and also a public consultation period. The document was hosted on the Canadian Standards Association website, and comments were received through their mechanisms for public comment as well. Because of my participation in US EPA, I went through a formal US EPA review as well, and then there was a lot of formatting, effort that went into getting it into its final shape, and it was finally released at the end of August in 2013. And I want to pause just for a second on this slide, and I would like to mention a couple individuals in particularly. V. Subramanian, he's currently in India, was a co-lead and put a tremendous amount of effort into this guidance document. Carolina Scarenzi, who was with the Chilean network of LCA at the time, I think is in Argentina now, also played a very heavy role in the writing and organizing of the text, as well as many of the other chapter authors that are mentioned. I mentioned our steering committee before, and those that submitted substantial comments are also listed below. So since that time, I have a few slides about the usage and impact of the guidance that I'd like to share. Well, first, before I mention that, after the initiative published the guidance document, it has not been active, except for maintaining the website and a few educational presentations. But otherwise, I mean, the initiative was really developed to produce the guidance document, and that was its role. Because it was all voluntary, everyone sort of had to get back to their normal business after that. So there's been no extensive effort to track the impact or usage of the guidance by the initiative or the ACLCA PCR committee since that time, except what I'm about to present. We have tracked. We require, one of the reasons we published the document on PCRguidance.org is that we wanted to find out who was using the document. We did require registration for download for those that acquired the document that way. And what I can tell you is that we've had downloads from about 500 unique registered and legitimate users at PCRguidance.org. So these are not repeat users. These are not spam bots or anything like that, but these are people that provided their names and organizational affiliations as well. And we also know it's circulated much more widely, just being sharing via email, or you could download it in an unregistered way, or it's been posted on some other websites as well. But it's interesting to see the download, to look at those downloads by organization type and see that it's been pretty well split across industry and trade associations and consulting firms, academics, and then there are those from standards and certification bodies or international organizations and government agencies as well. And by region, it's really, there's a lot of evidence that it has not just been circulated and read in North America. There were just as many legitimate downloads from people in Europe, and there was also those from Latin America and Asia, and some from Australia and New Zealand as well. ACLCA did a very simple email survey to just ping the known program operators in North America and those that they could contact outside of North America to find out if they were aware of the guidance document and had used it. In North America, 8 of 8 that responded to the survey were aware of the document, and 7 of 8 have used it or continue to use the document. Globally, the 3 of the 3 responded to the questionnaire were aware of the guidance document, and 2 of 3 have used it. And also, incidentally, the U.S. ISO tag representatives to the ISO standards, as well as the U.S. Green Building Council, are aware of the guidance document. Jeff Zeman, who's a current member of the ACLCA PCR committee, but was not part of the PCR committee at the time this effort was launched, so he wasn't involved in the development of the guidance, has shared a testimonial with us about the value of the guidance document. He represents the plumbing, or he's part of the Plumbing Manufacturers International Trade Association, who took an initiative to develop their own product category rule guidance specific for their the plumbing industry, and they've published that at this point. This is before this was, or since that he provided this testimonial, and he said that he was made aware at an early stage of the PCR guidance, and they found it to be very useful as an educational tool and a kind of roadmap in developing their specific guidance documents. So there's some good indication that it's been useful beyond program operators or standards bodies or others, and that it's been of use to industry groups as well that are interested in PCRs and EPDs. So thank you, Jeff, for providing that. Just some other notes. We were engaged very early stage with those that would administer the Product Environmental Footprint Program, which was kind of being put together at the same time the guidance document was being written. And actually, they served on our steering committee. Michaela Galatola did, and some of the experts that were developing the standards for the PEF, the technical standards, also provided extensive comments on our document. So an attempt was made at that time to align the requirements for the PCRs and the PEF, which are called PCRs, with this guidance document. Now, some are not aware of that, so I wanted to mention it. Also, the International EPD System contacted us right after the guidance was published. They were involved in the process in the review stage, and they did take our template and they made an adapted version of it as a template they use for PCR development, and that's still probably the largest EPD system in the world. So we think it was valuable that they did that. Right after the guidance was published, a new work item was created under ISO to develop an ISO technical specification for product category rules. And we were made aware of that at the time. We weren't the leads on that. We're Spinolaf writing in Sweden, and Eva Schmink in Germany. But they were both engaged in our PCR guidance development process, and they decided it was time to propose an ISO standard for product category rules guidance. So it is currently a working draft now. So that proposal was accepted, and it's been made into a working draft called the Development of Product Category Rules, and the number is 14027. And if you are a member of an ISO tag, then it is now that document is now open for comment. So one of the prime references that they use in that document is this guidance. So I just have one slide about current management and future plans, and that's to say that while the initiative was formed, I mentioned the initiative has not really been active since that time. So it's the ACLCA PCR committee is now what I'll call the steward of the guidance. I mean, they're sort of now the responsible party for the guidance document. And the PCR committee has discussed this over the last number of months and has decided to wait until the development of ISO 14027 before considering revisions or update to the guidance document. Again, this is supposed to supplement existing standards, and being that an active standard that's basically building off the guidance document is in progress, we don't think it's the time to consider revisions and updates at this point. Once 14027 is finalized, if it is, then it would be time to consider whether it's time to do a revision. I mean, if the PCR guidance is still appropriate, or what to do next. So I'm checking my time. I think I've left myself enough time to get into the details of the guidance. So what I'd like to do is this, with this section of the talk, is spend particularly some time on some elements that I haven't discussed in depth before, but I will still provide the general overview of the contents of the guidance document. The guidance package includes the guidance document and the PCR template that I've mentioned that's in a Word format. There are also supplementary documents, including a conformity assessment form, which I'm not sure if it's actively used by anyone, but it basically takes all the requirements and the recommendations from the guidance document and puts them in this form for being able to check whether or not they were followed. We did track and publish all of our public comments received and the responses that we made, so those are all available if you're wondering about the evolution of the document, and there's some additional information that's available as well. So I've talked most about what's in the content of Chapter 1 of the guidance document. The following chapters are on the preparation for PCR development. Then what's in the PCR, the elements of the PCR, is Chapter 3. Chapter 4 is recommendations for review of the PCR. Chapters 5 and 6 are publishing and use of the PCR. And 7 is just some additional best practices for PCR development and management. I won't talk about the annexes further, but there were some valuable annexes. I've received some questions over periods of time on if there are resources for these kinds of things. Particularly Annex 3, the comparison of systems of product classification was done, and it's available as an annex. So some additional criteria for selection of LCIA methods is in there as well, and I think that's been a very hot topic recently. I won't go step through this in detail, but I just wanted to point you toward the end of Chapter 1. If you're not familiar with it, there is a diagram that shows all of the steps in a flowchart form in PCR development, from determining whether or not a PCR is needed all the way until the publication and use of a PCR. It also shows which actors should be involved in the process at those various stages, and then which sections of the guidance to refer to that describe those steps in the process. In general, the parties that are involved are a program operator, and this is we provide some additional guidance on what their role was, but we don't define precisely what a program operator is beyond what's defined in ISO 14025. A PCR committee, of course, those are the main drafters of the PCR, and the PCR review committee provides the formal review, and then the public is engaged in the public consultation. So we had to decide really early on when are PCRs needed and when they're not. And again, we're just following up mostly on the language and the standards here, that PCRs are needed for standardized forms of product declarations or labels. We also do recommend them for product category benchmarking, as it provides a rule to create a benchmark on. And sometimes in other cases, just for LCA kind of studies, they can be useful to use because they provide just a reference set of rules, but they're not required. Program operators for sure have to be identified and involved from the beginning of the process. So this is one of the points I wanted to spend a little bit more time on, and that's how do product categories are defined. I haven't talked about this extensively before, but we had quite a lot of conversation about this during the development of the guidance, and decided that that product categories should primarily be defined by product functionality, just like in LCA. Generally, the framework is designed to evaluate products based on a functional unit, their use. So this does mean that it's not just by certain material type or product classification code that should limit what a PCR applies to, because you should be able to, with a PCR, compare different, like a thing that's made of concrete or plastic or wood that performs the same function as a thing that's made of another material. So they might have very different life cycles, but the PCR should be broad enough that it should enable comparison, because a comparison, again, is supposed to be on function. Quality, though, can be a part of that functional unit definition. We refer really to the ILCD guidance on functional unit definition, and there's more information in the chapter 3 on that in the guidance document. But we do recognize that quality is important to take into account. And finally, in chapter 7, we also mention a little more on there, and we kind of are pushing to advocate for broader definition of product categories in relation to functionality, if possible, to reduce the total number of PCRs which must be developed and improve comparability across that kind of functionality. As I mentioned before, this is really the first time in any guidance document or standard that we go into any depth is gone into on what to do if an existing PCR is out there. And this was, as I mentioned, is really a problem with the PCR duplication. So we defined some additional terms like a revised PCR, an adapted PCR, and a unified PCR, but it's not so much the terms that are important as understanding the process and the steps that are involved. So this diagram that's from chapter 2 captures those steps, and basically it's the gist of it is that when a PCR exists, then you want to make your best attempt to use that, and that could be either small revisions or a minor adaptation, or if there's already a PCR that's been published and you know that it needs to be updated, and it's possible to work with the previous program operator that was involved in the PCR. And then we proposed this idea of a unified PCR. This would involve more than one program operator in developing it, and it would more or less take the place of a previous, or supersede a previous PCR from another program operator. Something else I want to talk about here is the definition of the underlying LCA and its requirement. We came to the decision, and after discussion, that it really has to be required that a PCR is developed after an underlying LCA, or an LCA has been done of a product in that category. I think the reason being is that it's really difficult to make rules for something if you've never done a study of it before. So how do you make all the LCA rules if there's no LCA has been done of that before? And then there were some requirements for exactly what would have to be in that underlying LCA for it to be sufficient for that, such that it would have to have an equivalent functional unit, and the scope would need to be equivalent. So we said, we didn't say exactly matching, but we said equivalent here. Chapter 3 describes the major elements that are required in PCRs. So this is really, okay, the PCR should have this, and this in it. And this is also very familiar to many LCA practitioners, because these are often the elements that are in an LCA study, but there's some additional elements in there, not so familiar to those not at the EPD world, like the additional information requirements that are in there. I'll talk about a few of those in more depth. Of course, the functional unit and system boundary, just like with an LCA, has to be included. We think that actually a diagram of the system boundaries needs to be included in that PCR as well. Something a little bit different from the LCA general guidelines on cutoff rules or choosing cutoffs is that we actually recommend avoiding all cutoff rules by specifying exactly what types of flows are to be included in the life cycle inventory of the study, so that there are not differences there in the end of what's included and what's not. The primary data and secondary data I'm going to talk about in a minute, and I want to spend a little more time on that as well as the impact methods. So a little more on the LCI data requirements. So for primary data, we said the PCR shall specify all processes that need to be included in the life cycle and all types of flows that are included in the life cycle. And this relates to what I mentioned in the previous slide about the cutoffs. So primary data, again, is anything that is part of the foreground of the system, that is basically data or operations that are under the direct control of the manufacturer. We also think primary data templates can be provided. That can be a very effective way of making sure primary data is captured in a consistent and comparable way. Secondary sources, we stated, must be specified and or provided, and this was something new as well. When we mean specified, we mean down to the letter, saying you need to use this LCI database and this particular process and version, or we're going to provide you exactly that upstream LCI that you can use for transportation or electricity. This is really critical for comparability, is having comparability in the background data. There's a concept in ISO 14025 on the use of information modules, which are basically EPDs that were done for another product category that would fit upstream in your life cycle. So we elaborate a little bit on those. And of course, we state that all the data, primary or secondary, need to meet the data quality requirements, which also have to be specified by the PCR. So a little more on LCI selection. There's been a lot of chatter about this recently, and at least in North America, about which impact methods to include. So the guidance document does not mandate any specific impact categories or methods. For one, this is a global guidance document. Number two is we're building on and trying to be consistent with all of the existing standards, so it's basically impossible at this level and applying to all product categories for us to have specified specific impact categories and methods in this guidance document. What we do say is that the methods need to be scientifically, technically valid and relevant, and define those in the same way that the ISO 14044 does. They need to be appropriate for the geographical context of the anticipated EPDs. So some impact methods are designed really to represent potential impacts in certain geographies. So it's important to take that into account when these are selected, and possibly use multiple impact methods that account for multiple geographies if needed. So for each impact category that's selected, then the PCR needs to specify exactly which method for that impact category to use, and which associated characterization factors shall be actually clearly referenced or actually provided as an addendum to the PCR, so there's no lack of understanding about exactly what method or characterization factors to use. Of course, additional information is one of those components that's not typically in an LCA study, but it is in an EPD. And we didn't specify particular methods for other types of environmental or social impacts of concern. It was just premature in the field to do that. It probably still is, but we say those do have to be spelled out in the PCR. And it is really important for the PCR and then the end EPD to clearly state all of the important assumptions that were made in the development of the results that are presented in the EPDs. there has to be a review panel or review committee, and they should provide a review report that needs to be made public, be publicly available along with the PCR. There should also be a public consultation period that'll last at least 30 days. Let me just make a disclaimer: is when I'm speaking and describing these things, if I say should and it's in shall in the guidance, please defer to the guidance. I'm just trying to summarize all of these and not using the language always as is, but we do differentiate between shall, should, and may, and the guidance document. So please refer there and not to what I've said during this webinar. I might have misspoken. I'll also, just regarding the review, that not just the review report, but also the public comments need to be published and available. And it's also important to have some kind of appeals mechanism in place for those when a PCR is published and there's some major issues in it, and still their comments want to be submitted by an external party. So I'll just cover briefly the last few chapters. The PCRs all must be publicly available, readily discoverable, and easily accessible. We did not require that all PCRs be free. There were some participants in the effort that made good cases that it was there were certain conditions that PCRs are actually standards. They're issued by standards body, and they're sold under licenses. So our recommendation is at least to make them publicly available and easily accessible. Of course, we prefer that they be freely available. It has to be in a language that's appropriate for end users. We didn't recommend just English. If the PCR is designed to work in a non-English speaking country, then it needs to be available in that language. But we recommended an English translation be available for, again, comparability and adaptation to another region. That would be maybe just another region of the world. Program operators can make minor updates to PCRs within some established limits that we provided without starting up a new PCR committee, but a major, what we call a revision, does require a PCR committee. PCRs in general can't be valid for greater than 5 years. We have a very short chapter on use of PCRs because this is really beyond the scope of the guidance, except to say that the format, the content of what's in a claim or a final EPD in most cases really is determined by the program and/or standard and not by the PCR guidance document. What we do provide in use is some basic comparability criteria that says the PCRs, in order for EPDs comparable, they have to have met a number of these elements, described elements in the PCRs, or they're otherwise not, they're still not comparable. Chapter 7 was sort of our opportunity to describe some best practices and elaborate on some ideas for future development of PCRs, and I want to mention just a couple in particular right now. One is the second bullet, that PCRs must adapt to the digital age. Some of us felt that PCRs really are something that could be rendered in a tool or software type environment, and EPDs could be generated maybe in a more consistent kind of automated way through that mechanism. And actually since that time we've seen some of those tools that have come out there, and I'm not going to mention any or advocate for any of those in particular at this time, but I would say that that has been done since this document was published. I also want to mention that we described that a global PCR repository and central notification mechanism were needed at the time, and still there is not a global PCR repository that's out there. Some initial efforts toward that end have not been fruitful, so there's still a major need for people to be able to find out if a PCR has been published on a product category without just having to do random, web searches or search the program operators that they're familiar with. So that's all, and I've wanted to leave some time at the end for questions, and that's what I have for today. It's still, the PCR guidance is still available on the website, and we still have the generic email address, the PCRguidance@gmail.com. If you have specific questions, you can send them there, but I would also recommend that you copy my personal address, because we don't check the PCR guidance email as regularly as we should. As I mentioned now, the ACLCA PCR committee is really the steward of the PCR guidance, and Naji Kasem is the current chair of the ACLCA PCR committee, and that's his email address. He's also on the webinar today. And the website for the PCR guidance, the website for the ACLCA PCR committee is provided there. That's all that I have. Thanks, Debbie. I'll look for some questions now. Okay. Well, I'm looking at the questions that were submitted in the questions box right now. The first question is, would the guidance PCR document be applicable for all types of EPDs? So that was certainly our intention with the guidance document, is that they be applicable to all types of EPDs, and not just EPDs, but products, carbon footprints, or water footprints, other types of single attribute labels as well. Christoph Koffler is on the line. I should have said thank you to Christoph for providing some of the information on the development of ISO 14027. Christoph has said that it's actually not just an ISO 207 tag member, but you need to be a member of the subtag 3 to provide official comments on the ISO 14027 standard at this stage. So what guidance do you have for developing PCRs that are acceptable to multiple program operators? That's a very good question. Again, our intention of the guidance was that PCRs become more consistent and comparable, so that they would look the same, being published by multiple, coming out of different program operators. But I realize that many program operators have their own rule sets. However, again, some of our guidance apply to extending or just defining more clearly the roles of the program operators in respect to PCR development. So if they're defining those, if they're agreeing to the roles that are defined in the guidance document, then the PCRs that come out should be acceptable to more than one program operator to an extent. Someone else asked, if you were going to specify what exact upstream processes must be used, how do you avoid specifying a particular software that would be used for the LCA? It would seem the use of Gabi or EcoInvent would now be baked into PCRs. Well, this is a good and legitimate question. There's been some studies that have been done or presented recently that indicate that even if you're using the same background, the same LCA database and the same impact methods, that in some cases, not the majority of the cases, but in some cases, you would end up having different results. So that could be that could potentially be the case, though a lot of that can be overcome. In general, when we talk about databases, then yeah, a database at least needs to be available in a particular software. But in general, we try to separate the databases and the software. Databases ideally should be available in multiple software. But I think it's a legitimate concern. It's a really good question, but because we're trying to make sure the results are comparable to the greatest extent possible in the background data and the results that are produced from the tool. So it's a really good point. I'll just leave it at that. If many PCRs, Sean Hunter asked, if many PCRs have not been followed this guidance, then what should we conclude about the usefulness of EPDs regarding comparability? That's a really good question. But I would say even for those that have followed the guidance, I mean, we don't have 100% proof that the guidance is going to, if everyone followed the guidance to the letter, that they're going to achieve 100% comparability at the end. I mean, comparability is the ideal. It is certainly important, but we really need more kind of quantitative proof of comparability in the end coming out of these standards in the guidance document. The usefulness of EPDs, I think, I mean, we just should recognize that comparability is just very difficult to achieve, and we're working our way there, but we're probably not there yet. I think it's still a good statement of transparency. Hopefully, it's fairly accurate, representing those life cycle assessment impacts. But in a lot of cases, there are not a lot of multiple EPDs for the same product category still. So I would be interested in finding out still to what extent users have tried to compare EPDs for the same categories and try to use them for decision making. These are some great questions. I won't have time to get to every one of them, but I'll try to hit at least a few more. Why is so one user asked, why is it 5 years the time for the update? This was the 5 years, I think, was a time that had come out of an earlier guidance document that the ACLCA committee had done for the program operators. The thought was that it's just that data becomes a little bit irrelevant after that period of time, that there might be better sources of data to use and recommended or tools, or there may be methodological changes or new impact methods that come out, for instance. So there's some idea that it needs to be reconsidered at least after the 5-year period, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a full revision, but it needs to be reviewed again, and at least minor updates need to be made to bring it up to make sure it's relevant in the present. When multiple PCRs for a product category exist, is there any guidance that we can use to determine the best one? Well, I mean, from the guidance development perspective, we would look for a PCR that was compliant to the greatest extent with this guidance document, as well as the standards that it was based on, like 14025. That's the best answer that I can give you there. So we have our conformity assessment form, which is not I agree, it's not, I mean, I'll acknowledge it's not the most eloquent form, but at least it captures the idea. Another question about specifying the secondary data sources. Yes, again, they should specify exactly which data set to use from which database. Are there other PCR guidance documents freely available? Kelly Scanlon asked that. There are industry-specific PCR guidance documents that have been developed. I mentioned the one for the plumbing industry before. I know IERE was involved in developing one related to textiles and clothing. So they're more industry-specific guidance that I know of, and then there are the international standards. But this is the only PCR guidance document that applies to all product categories that I know of. Here's a great question: is there a need to define what constitutes an industry average EPD? Is it something that could be included in future documents? So thanks, Hillary, for that question. We tried to address this a little bit in Sector 2 and exactly what is, I mean, because there have been these industry average, or what we call in the guidance document sector, EPDs that are out there now, but we don't have a whole lot of guidance exactly what that would indicate. So yes, I definitely agree with you, Hillary. There could be something in there, not necessarily in this guidance document. It could be somewhere elsewhere, or more guidance on what comprises an industry average EPD. Has there been any substantial work done on using formal ontologies to coordinate standard language and data sources in the U.S.? Actually, it's funny that you mentioned this, just because our group is involved in developing some work with LCA ontologies, but I could, if you send me an email about that, I could provide you some more information. Susanna, who was one of the attendees at the course that I gave at LCA 2013, she's asking is the PCR's ultimate goal is to introduce a global and local necessary attributes in order to make more sustainable products worldwide. It won't describe exactly what those sustainability is. It's still the point is to make sure that they're just assessed on a comparative basis, and it is capturing those most important sustainability attributes in that assessment. Okay, finally, can you recommend the major sources to find PCRs for different construction products? Again, we don't, well, I'm not going to recommend any particular registry that's out there, but there are some existing registries. There's one that was a global registry that was maintained by the Taiwan EPD system, but it's certainly not complete. And otherwise, there haven't been a lot of efforts to develop formal registries. So for finding, we do provide some guidance actually in Chapter 2, and I probably won't remember all of the details, so I won't mention them there. But please see Chapter 2 of the guidance document for some recommendations on how to find PCRs for existing PCRs for different products. So with Debbie, with that, I'll turn it back over to you. I've addressed the majority of the questions here, and we're running out of time.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Wes, and thank everyone for joining us for the webinar today. As I mentioned earlier, an email will be sent out on Monday with a recording of the webinar. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@aclca.org, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks again.